Hi everyone, welcome to the January 6th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and this week we are looking ahead to the Saturday card at Aqueduct. It's the beginning of their Derby prep season in New York as they're running their first stakes race for 3-year-olds. That is the Jerome, the 8th race on Saturday, offering 10 Kentucky Derby qualifying points to the winner of that race. But that's not the only stakes on this Aqueduct Saturday card, as they're also running the Queen's County, a race that was supposed to be run on New Year's Eve last Saturday, but had to be rescheduled once fog caused the cancellation of that card. So we're getting that double whammy of stakes action on Saturday. And Craig, for an all-dirt winter race day, this pick 5 sequence has come up pretty interesting with some well-sized fields.
It has. Even the non-stakes races have good-sized fields. I think the smallest might be 9, going off the top of my head here. But the stakes both drew good, solid fields. No small fields here. So it's going to be a tough pick 5 to hit. It's certainly a fun one to handicap.
Yeah, and there's a nice mix of different types of races in this sequence. It starts off with a maiden special weight for the newly turned 3-year-old fillies, moving on to a claiming race that has horses from all different class levels converging, then those 2 stakes, the Jerome and the Queen's County, and closing things out with a pretty complicated New York-bred allowance race. We'll get to that at the end of the podcast, though. Let's kick off this pick 5 sequence with that maiden race that begins in race 6. Like I said, this one is for the 3-year-old fillies going the 6 furlong distance on the dirt. And Craig, I think this is really a question of whether or not you think this is finally going to be the day for Spelterini, who's been a short price on a number of occasions, or whether you're more interested in first-time starters.
Spelterini's never the kind of horse that I want to try to build a ticket around. She's disappointed, as you said, at least a couple times at short prices. She always seems to run okay, but she's also always losing ground in that last furlong, except for her debut, where she made up some. But otherwise, she's just not the kind of horse that I like. And I do think there's some interesting alternatives. We have several first-time starters in here, and that's where I'm going to start. The one that interested me the most was Fabulous Funny, the 2-horse, being trained by Anthony Dutrow. And he's an interesting guy. He kind of had a lull in his career for a while, and if you just pull up his stats in Formulator and you look up his first-time starters, you're going to see pretty ugly stats. It's going to say 3 for 40 for the last 5 years with a pretty terrible ROI. But if you've been paying attention, it's not been the same since he came back from his lull. Has more horses in his barn. If you just look at 2022, he sent out 14 first-time starters. He had 3 wins. Not only that, he had 4 horses run second. So it does seem there's a change in the barn.
Yeah, I think you make some really good points about that horse, Fabulously Funny. She's also one that I was interested in. And just looking at the work tab, there are some pretty quick drills, which might suggest that this filly could be quick. I like the progeny of Practical Joke. When they start their careers off, he wins at a pretty high rate with his first-time starters, I think around 18%. So Fabulously Funny, she does make plenty of sense in here, and she's a horse that I would also want to include pretty prominently. And as for Spelterini, just to kind of wrap her up, I know we kind of glossed over her. She ran so well in her debut at Saratoga, and I never like when a horse from a barn like Bill Mott runs so well in debut and then never really progresses from there. I mean, she's arguably regressed in subsequent starts because she hasn't been quite as competitive as that half-length loss when she actually finished ahead of subsequent Grade 1 winner Chocolate Gelato. And I didn't like her race 2 back in the slop at Aqueduct when she was beaten by a good horse, Good Sam, a first-time starter for the Chad Brown barn, but she was really losing ground at the end of the race, barely beat today's rival Risk Free, who's not really one that most people would consider a contender in this race, so I definitely have my reservations about Spelterini. There are some other first-time starters in here, Craig, that you could consider. I mean, all on the outside, you've got the number 9, Senior Prank, daughter of Into Mischief, certainly one that you can build a case for, and another Into Mischief, the number 5, Trying My Heart Out, who has plenty of pedigree and going out for a barn that can be dangerous at times.
Yeah, that's the 2 I was also going to bring up for first-time starters. Senior Prank, it's Chad Brown, it's Into Mischief. you know what you're going to get. You're probably not going to get a lot of value, but I don't think she's a horse you would want to leave off your ticket and get knocked out in the first leg just because maybe she'll be overbet a little bit. I think she's a must-use in here. I'm not so confident in trying my heart out. I looked at the trainer, pulled him up in Formulator, Jose Camejo, and he was 0 for 16 last year with his first-time starters with, I think it was just 1 second-place finish. So while he has struck with first-timers in the past, it's been a while since he did that. And I was curious about the morning line, if maybe there were some works. I see the last work was pretty good and has had several fast works, actually. So I'm going to assume that's why the morning line is as low as it is.
Yeah, I mean, if this horse had a higher profile jockey on its back, I think I actually would have made the morning line even lower because it does seem like there are some quick workouts here. What I will say about this horse, the number 4, Trying My Heart Out, is that $400,000 for this pedigree actually seems a little bit light to me. I mean, like you said, she's an Into Mischief, and the dam side, the horses in this pedigree have done pretty well. The dam Miss Hollywood, she was a good horse who I think was a minor stakes winner, going 7 furlongs on the dirt. She's a half-sister to Honor AP. The second dam is Hollywood Story, who's had progeny that have sold for a ton of money. Hollywood Story, she was, I think, a multiple graded stakes winner, actually a grade 1 winner, routing on the dirt. So interesting that this horse sold for $400,000. Also a little bit interesting the connections this horse winds up with. I think these are connections that compete in Louisiana a lot for Jose Camejo, who does have horses down there. So just some interesting things going on with that one. I'll be interested to see how she does at her debut. Just a little more insight that I'll give into the number 9, Senior Prank, that Chad Brown runner. It's a bit more of a turf pedigree on the bottom side, so sometimes that's a good sign when Chad Brown runs these horses that have a little bit of turf in their pedigrees on the dirt. Might say they're doing well in their dirt workouts. I would watch the first race at Aqueduct on Friday. We're actually recording this Friday morning, so we haven't seen that yet, but seems like this horse was working in company with a Klarovich horse named Uncorrelated, who's running in that first race on Friday, so maybe see how that fellow, Chad Brown Firster, does with relation to this one. It could give you some clues on how these two have been working together. But definitely seems like if you're going against Spelterini, the Firsters could be where it's at in here because it's hard to build a case for anybody else with experience.
Yeah, I would agree. I guess the one horse maybe people will look at as risk-free because she's run okay in the past, but to me, she just doesn't seem fast enough. She's another that's always backing up through the lane. Always kind of seems to show up and run a race, just maybe not quite good enough to win at this level.
Yeah, I guess the one first we didn't mention was Machiavellic, the number 3 for Tommy Albertrani. A barn that isn't known for first out success, but if you look up the stats in Formulator, he's actually got a pretty healthy ROI with first-time starters, just a lower win percentage, but when they do strike, they do so at prices. This one's got a big German turf pedigree on the bottom side, so that doesn't really say sprinting on dirt at 6 furlongs, but it is a Daughter of Honor code, so maybe some interesting things going on there for a horse that does show a quick gate workout last week.
And as always, at least this is the first leg with all these first-time starters, so you'll get to see some how the betting is going. Not that you want to latch on the horses that take money necessarily, but at least you'll have an idea of what kind of value you're getting.
Let's move on to the second leg of this sequence, race 7. This is a $25,000 claimer going the one-turn mile on the main track. Field of 13 signed on, 12 betting interests, with 2 of them being coupled in the wagering, a Rudy Rodriguez entry. And Craig, this is really a story of class droppers. We've got 2 of them in particular here that I think are going to take quite a bit of money. The number 7, Musical Heart, has to be the real question mark in this race. And I know I don't think it's a big secret, you were doing covering for me on the morning lines last week, and he was entered in a similar spot, I think on the day they canceled last Saturday, and they redrew this race. It seems like it came up an even tougher spot on the redraw, and a similar drop in class off the long layoff for Musical Heart. And I always find horses like this the toughest to peg on the morning line because sometimes they're completely dead on the board, sometimes they're well meant on the drop down, and it's really hard to figure out which category this horse could fall into because his form back in early 2021 would make it pretty tough for anybody in this field else to win. But I mean, you have to be pretty skeptical of this huge drop in class off the layoff.
Right. I mean, he's entered for 25,000. I'm always going to take a somewhat negative view of these horses. If a horse like him beats me, so be it. Then he beats me. I'm not saying I won't use him, though. I probably won't. It just depends how it comes, how the tickets look, and how much I want to spend. There's not really a lot of clues with this. When you look at the workouts, there's some gaps in the workouts. There isn't a whole bunch of them. They're not particularly fast. So I don't see anything too positive about it, other than trainer Rob Atras has been winning at a pretty high rate. So playing this race vertically, I would certainly be watching the board. If he's cold at all, I think he's a total toss, but that's not going to help us a lot in the pick 5. I would say he's kind of the opposite of the other dropper I assume you're talking about, Warstopper, who you have pegged as the morning line favorite in here. He's a horse who, to me, seems like he's taking a more logical drop-in class. He's a popular horse at the claiming box. He keeps getting taken ever since he's been claimed by Falcone out of the Todd Pletcher barn a while back. He tried him at 50 a few times in there. He went back up in allowance races. He actually won an off-the-turf allowance race, but this seems like a more logical spot than Musical Heart, where it just seems like they're happy to get rid of him. This is a more logical form drop, and I think he's really logical in here. He's coming back on short rest just a week. I guess it depends if you're a fan of that or not. But that's often the MO of David Jacobson, who started training again on the NYRA circuit. Is also dropping pretty quickly off the claim looking to get a win.
Yeah, if it were a different barn, I might be more concerned about it, but kind of what you were alluding to. It's been a while since we've been able to familiarize ourselves with David Jacobson's trainer patterns, but I'm sure you remember, as do a lot of our listeners, this is a move that we used to see him do all the time, these huge drops in class just to kind of get a horse out of the barn and take the win on the way out. Make no mistake about it, they're going to lose money on this horse because they claimed him for $62,500. This race just has a $50,000 purse. I say just, that's a pretty high purse for a $25,000 claimer, but even if they get the winning share of the purse and this horse gets claimed for $25,000, they're still going to be out, nearly $10,000 on this horse. Generally, for most trainers, that's not a good sign, but it does feel like often Jacobson just places these horses to win, and he's got plenty of races in his recent past performances, as you were highlighting, that would make him pretty tough for this field to handle. And I'll just say specifically about his last race, the one that took place just about 8 days ago, that was a pretty tough allowance field. Sheriff Bianco had been in great form. The winner, Pirate Rick, just ran out of his skin for Lynn Cash. That was a long shot winner, but a horse that had run well in the past and got back to those good races. And 6 furlongs just seems like it was on the short side for Warstopper. So getting back out to the mile, he makes a whole lot of sense in here, and I think it does help him, unlike Musical Heart, that the pace projector thinks there's quite a bit of speed in this race, Craig, and any hitting that happens up front is going to help a closer like Warstopper.
Yeah, I would agree, and that's a good point about the distance. He's won 4 races in his career. None of them have been in sprint races. They've all been at a mile or longer. I'm glad you brought up the pace, because I did want to mention that. That kind of leads me to a couple other horses I'm talking about. I'll start with the entry, particularly the 1A Perceived. When the scratches come out, I'm almost hoping that the 1 is going to be scratched and Perceived will run by himself, because I much prefer him to his entry mate Runabout. He's a horse who the pace is likely to help. It's another that is getting what just feels like a very logical class drop. He hasn't been in claiming races in a long time, and I think his form's dirtied up a little bit, particularly by that last race where there was just no pace whatsoever. He didn't do a lot of running on one of those really slow off tracks with some moisture in it at Aqueduct, so I'm willing to give him another chance, particularly at this lower class level.
Yeah, I think there are some things to recommend about that horse. I worry a little bit about his current form, but like you said, sometimes the drop in class can really wake up horses like this, and especially if he's the half of the entry that participates, or even if Runabout's in there, I think this entry could be a decent price. So he's one that I did peg that I could use somewhere in my tickets. He wasn't my top pick, but I could use him on some backup wagers. The horse that I did put on top here, who is probably going to be a similar price or maybe a slightly higher price, is the number 10 Hammer and Armor. And I get that he's coming into this race not in the greatest form either. He's kind of been tailing off for a few months now in some lower level claiming races, 20,000. He's tried a couple times recently. He's just been descending the class ladder ever since he got into great form back in 2021. But what I will say about him is, go back and look at when he was previously in Gustavo Rodriguez's barn, because it was a similar situation where he had been off form for quite a while. Gustavo claimed him and immediately turned him around and got him to win 2 races in a row, just basically starting that form cycle of running about 4 or 5 races that achieved speed figures that would make him very competitive here, and was ultimately claimed away, held his form for a little bit for Pat Reynolds, and then kind of cycled through some barns and went off form. But this is a horse that at one time was in the barn of Rudy Rodriguez when Gustavo was his assistant. Then Gustavo claimed him and lost him. And I think it's interesting that he's dipping back in to take this horse for 20,000 and now moving him up in class to the 25 level. If he kind of has the keys to this horse and can figure out how to turn him around, his better races make him very competitive here, and I think he's going to get the right kind of pace set up with so much speed signed on in here. So at the price, he's definitely one that I want to use prominently, and I actually made him my top pick in this race, so he's one that I would use, but there are other places you can go in this race. I think the number 12, Dust Devil, is pretty logical. You just have to trust this 10-pound apprentice rider to work out a trip in a 13-horse field.
Yeah, I don't trust that, particularly when you have him pegged as one of the lower prices on the morning line. Another horse I think we should mention, because you just mentioned the horse that finished behind him last time, is Grumpy Little Tots. He's a horse who looked like he was in terrible form, having just been trounced 3 times in a row. I guess you have to ask yourself if it was the mud that woke him up last time, or if he finally dropped down to what was a better class level for him. I'm going to take that view, because he's run in the mud and in the slop before, and he's run okay, but he doesn't appear to have that mud-loving capability. If you're people out there that remember old DRF with the mud marks, I don't think he would have one. It's not like he had run great. So I tend to think maybe he's back in better form, and he's going to get some pace to close into.
No, I agree with that. I think he got back into some better form last time. I thought he got a good trip, all things considered, just kind of picking up the pieces along the rail, whereas the horse that I liked out of that race, Hammer and Armor, did more work, kind of trying to chase the pace, being taken out of his running style to keep a little bit closer to a quicker pace before fading at the end. So I preferred Hammer and Armor out of that race, but maybe Grump's Little Tots is turning things around. He's another one that certainly has back races that would make him competitive here if he could refine his better form, and perhaps that last race suggests that he is. So definitely many ways that you can go in this claiming 25,000 race that goes as the second leg of this Pick 5 sequence. Let's move on to the stakes portion of this Pick 5, beginning with race 8. It is the Jerome, going the 1 mile distance around 1 turn for the 3-year-olds. And Craig, I think we've got a pretty legitimate favorite in this race in the number 6, Arctic Arrogance. I mean, this horse just hasn't done a whole lot wrong so far in his career. Made his first 3 starts against New York breds, won 2 of them, was a pretty impressive winner of that Sleepy Hollow, going this distance 2 back, and can't critique his Remsen too much because he got beat by a horse that I think is improving at the right time, might be pretty good, WNL, and he gave this horse everything that he could handle down the lane, and just seems like Arctic Arrogance might be a class above these.
Yeah, I have no knocks at all on Arctic Arrogance. His Remsen was good. It was a fast race. It was a huge gap back to third in there, so I don't think there was anything fluky at all about that. He just got beat by a horse who was a little bit better that day. Maybe the turn back to 1 turn and cutting back a furlong could be a concern, but for a speed horse like him, I'm not overly concerned about that. The one thing I would have a little concern about, though, is he is facing some pretty fast horses. We have him shown back and forth on the pace projector, and he's a horse who in every single race has taken the lead, and he has his work cut out getting up there today, or he'll have to change tactics.
Yeah, he's what I do like about that pace situation with regard to him is that at least he is drawn outside of horses. So if runners like the number 4 Lugan Knight or the number 5 in particular Andiamo a Firenze, who looks like the real speed of this race, they decide to get really aggressive, at least Arctic Arrogance can sit outside of those foes because I don't think the two horses drawn to his outside are nearly as fast as those other speeds in the race. So I project him to get a pretty good trip here. I don't have too many concerns about his stamina, and I just think for a barn that's been in raging form itself, Linda Rice, it seems like everything she sends out is running well. You've got a horse that's doing well, and it just seems like it's a recipe for him to take this next step down the Derby trail. The horses that I think are his biggest threats, Craig, are some of the more lightly raced runners in here who do have a chance to improve. I personally am not a big fan of Andiamo a Firenze, who I guess could take some money in here, but I don't really view him as one that's going to be getting better over time. He's just a horse that's kind of stagnated from a speed figure standpoint, and his 1 mile race in the Champagne, I know we got a decent TimeformUS speed figure, but he really wasn't finishing at all that day, and I don't think he's a horse that gets better with that at distance.
No, I don't either. I won't have him on my tickets. I don't even really consider him a contender, mostly because of the distance concerns. And as you mentioned, he's basically run around the same figure he ran on debut every time out. Slight improvement in the Champagne figure-wise, but only a few points. So it lends some credence to what you're saying, that he's just not a horse who's going on with it. I'd prefer a few others in here. Obviously, the most lately raced horses on the inside neural network for Chad Brown. He's a horse who didn't take a lot of money, a lot of action in that debut, but he won easily. Didn't run a huge speed figure, but it doesn't seem like the distance will be a concern. I would expect him to improve, so I'm not going to totally knock him on saying he's too slow to win here, because I don't expect him to run that same speed figure. I would think he'd run better. The 4-horse Lugan Knight is another one who I think has to be considered a contender in here. His slowest speed figure is actually his win, when he had quite a bit of trouble, was blocked inside, got out and was able to get up and win, but he's a horse who the mile shouldn't be a problem. And if you take a look at his last race, the two that beat him have come out to do very well. Victory Formation went on to romp in the, I think it was the Smarty Jones at Oaklawn. Did very well that day, and 2 Eagles River came back to run second in a big stakes race at Oaklawn for 2-year-olds, finishing behind a very good Frosted Departure, a Ken McPeak sprinter that did pretty well that day. So I don't want to dismiss him either. And the other horse that has me intrigued that I have to use a little bit, because I just don't know what to make of him, is General Banker, who actually broke his maiden in a stakes race, I believe, last time. Did it with a decent figure of 101. I'm kind of leaning towards maybe it was the mud, but I just really liked what I saw from him. Looks like he took a big step forward.
Yeah, the 3 horses that you brought up are all horses that I want to talk about in this race. I'll go in reverse order. General Banker, I mean, I ended up going a little bit against him here. I'm not going to talk anybody off him because he'll be a big price in this race. But don't blame the connections for striking while the iron is hot. I mean, he clearly got into good form late last year. Even that second place finish back against Maiden Specialweight Company, the horse that won that race, Mariachi, is a very good horse, I believe, for the John Kimmel barn. That race came up fast, and General Banker was extremely wide the entire way, finishing second. So probably shouldn't have been a huge surprise when he caused that 10-1 upset in the stakes last time, breaking his maiden. He might just be a horse that's getting good right now, but it's got to stretch out to a mile. This is a tougher field, so I ultimately went a little bit against him. I think he's my 4th pick in this race, but I understand that there are some things to like about him. Number 4, Lugan Knight, who you also brought up, this horse has some attributes that I think are going to, bode well for his future. He's a hard trier. He's gotten a good education in a few of his starts, particularly 2 back when he broke his maiden. He was kind of stymied in behind horses in upper stretch, had to come between to win. I think he's developing nicely. I wonder if more distance is really going to suit him. The Golden Senses, they can be pretty versatile. There's a little bit more sprint pedigree on the dam side, but I did like the way he was finishing in that race behind Victory Formation last time, so I definitely think the talent is there for him to make the step up in class. Though I did make the number 1 Neural Network my top pick in this race, and I'm not sure how strong the field was that he was beating in his debut. It is a good sign that the third place finisher Drake's Passage did come back to win, and I think he improved his speed figure a little bit in his next start. And I just liked the way that Neural Network finished off that race. There's not a ton of pedigree here. He's by Cloud Computing, and what I've seen of the Cloud Computings, it does seem like they're doing better with more distance, so I like this horse stretching out. The dam side pedigree is pretty light. If you go back a few generations, it's the female family of Bernardini, but there hasn't been too much recent production at all. The thing that I found that I liked the most about this horse, though, was when I started diving into Formulator and looking at some stats for Chad Brown. With second-time starters that won their debuts going a mile on dirt in their first start against winners, Chad Brown is 8 for 16 over the past 5 years. That's a 50% win rate with a 244 ROI. So when he's got these horses that win sprinting on debut and then he runs them a mile on dirt next time, they generally win. So I know it's a step up in class, but I think this horse has room to go forward. So if he's around that 7-2 morning line, that's good enough for me.
Yeah, no problems with him at all. As I said, I expect improvement. One thing I'm going to have to do is go back and look and see if we get some improving speed figures for those from that 16 race sample. I'm going to guess that we did for sure.
Let's move on to the other stakes on this Saturday card. It is the Queen's County, going a mile and an eighth, 2 turns on the main track at Aqueduct, and this one held together pretty well from when it was drawn last Saturday. We've still got the favorite in here, the number 7 Law Professor, who is just clearly the horse to beat in this race, Greg, from a class standpoint. I mean, it's hard to knock his last couple of performances, or really, I should say, his last 3 performances if you include that turf race at Kentucky Downs, ever since he's come into the Rob Atras barn. He gave Life is Good everything that one could handle, too, back in the Woodward. It's not like Life is Good was in hand to win that race. Law Professor really made him work a little bit, and I don't even think his race in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile last time was that bad. So if he can handle the stretch out in distance back out to a mile and an eighth, which, I mean, there's no evidence in his PPs that says that he shouldn't, he's going to be tough to beat in this race.
Yeah, I mean, you might want to argue one of his best races came in the San Pasquale when he was second to Express Train at a mile and an eighth. So I don't think the distance is a problem. I remember this is one of the races I have made the morning line for, and I think I used the same morning line you did. So with a slightly different feel, but the 2-1, he does look like the horse to beat to me, and I have no real knocks on him. And after that, after him, I do think the race gets pretty cloudy. We have this one tabbed as a race with a fast pace on the TimeformUS pace projector. That's kind of iffy for me because the speed horses that we have up there is a little bit, it's not always, I should say. Thomas Shelby, I guess he is a speed horse. I've just never thought of him as all that fast. He's a horse who just kind of wants to be in the front, but it's not like he sets crazy fast paces. Then we have a horse like Seafoam in there who has at times set some fast paces but has been able to track. So it's going to be interesting to see how this race develops. Even a horse like Eloquist, who's shown in third on the pace projector, has done most of his best running on the front end. So I do see why the pace is labeled fast. I just wonder if it's not going to be a more tactical contest instead of getting really heated.
Yeah, I would say that the early pace of this race is going to be heavily dependent on Seafoam getting out of the gate, which has been a problem for him in his last few starts. He's just a horse that has always had a ton of early speed, and he wants to be in front, but he's just had minor issues at the gate now 3 times in a row. And breaking from the inside post position, you want to be able to take advantage of that heading right into the clubhouse turn. So I think Jorge Vargas, who gets aboard him here, is going to be looking to blast out of the gate, but the horse has to cooperate. So if you're hoping that the pace materializes for a closer in this race, I think you're going to be watching that start for Seafoam. And Thomas Shelby, I agree with you. He's not the fastest horse, but he generally is contesting the pace, so I expect him to be up there early, mixing it up. I mean, Craig, I think if you're going against Law Professor, the kind of obvious horse that, is improving at the right time that could be a real threat to him is the number 2 Unbridled Bomber. And I mean, you know that I've got plenty of love for this horse. I've been on his bandwagon for a long time. Unfortunately, didn't stay on it when he wanted a huge price too back. But still, this is a horse that I always thought had potential, and it seems like he's finally fulfilling it now, as he's late in his 3-year-old season, now having just turned 4 years old. His last couple of victories at Aqueduct, they've both come up fast. It's clear that distance is no problem for this horse. And what I liked about his last race is, even though the pace was slower, he showed a new dimension, being able to sit a little bit closer than he has in some prior starts. And I think if he could not lose too much ground, or I should say, give away too much of a margin from the leaders, saving ground from this inside post position, that's going to help his chances here.
I think he's really dangerous in here. When I was looking at his form, I was trying to figure out what made him turn it around, because as you say, that day he won at the big price at Aqueduct, or Belmont at the Big A. It kind of came out of nowhere. He wasn't really showing any kind of form, and I was wondering, was it the change back to Aqueduct? Was there equipment change, which there wasn't? Couldn't really find anything, but I guess if it was a change back to Aqueduct, that's a good thing, because that's where we're running on Saturday. So in the end, it doesn't matter. I'm just looking at his last 2 races, and they're both really good, and he looks like he's going to get pace to run into. Maybe not as hot as the pace projector would indicate, but I don't think it's going to be a race where they're going 50 on the front end or anything like that. So I do give him a big shot in here, and almost as much as Law Professor. I would almost consider them co-A's for me.
It's funny, I was watching the interview with his trainer, James Ryerson, after he won that race 2 back, and he was kind of saying, this is a horse that's always been really difficult to ride over time. I've tried all different types of equipment on him. I had blinkers on him, I had front wraps on him, I had different types of bridles and bits on him, and he said, for that race 2 back, I just decided, maybe I'm overcomplicating things. Let's just take it all off and just have like a normal set of equipment, and the horse responded really well and actually ran the 2 best races of his career, so he kind of was like, maybe I shouldn't mess with it anymore. So, I don't know if it's that simple. Maybe the horse just came around himself, but you're right. His last 2 races, if he maintains that form and continues progressing along those lines, he's the biggest threat to Law Professor in this race. And once you get outside of these 2, Craig, it's, you're looking at some bigger prices, some horses that do have back races that would make them contenders here, but you have to wonder a little bit about the recent form. You've got Double Crown all the way on the outside, who definitely has some races in his PPs that would make him tough here, but didn't do too well on the redraw, getting stuck all the way out in that outside post position, and he's also a horse that I'm not sure 1 1/8 is necessarily his best distance.
No, I would agree with that. He seems more like the Mahler type to me. Maybe 1 1/16 is his best. As you said, the draw didn't give him any favors. This is a race I'm not going to spread very much. I'll probably stick with those 2 as my A's. The only other horse I would have considered was maybe Seafoam could somehow get out and steal it, but with the gate issues you mentioned, it's hard for me to latch on to somebody else, and I'd prefer to spread in some of the other races here.
Yeah, I just want to mention 2 other horses. Bourbonic, who is back at the distance and sight of his biggest triumph in the Wood Memorial. Definitely a horse that has some things to prove, because he kind of tailed off at the end of his 3-year-old season, and clearly, didn't earn much of a speed figure when he came back off the layoff last time, but that 7 furlong race was clearly just a prep for going longer. I don't think they were too serious about winning that race, and he kind of did what you'd expect Bourbonic to do, dropping way out of contention early and doing his best running at the end. He put in a big gallop out in that race, so it's possible that he could go forward off that, but he's going to really have to take that step forward, because he just never really ran the kind of speed figures that you'd hope he'd move on to after winning that Wood Memorial as a 3-year-old, and now he's just turned 5 years old, so clearly he's got some things to prove. But he's one that does have the class going back through his races that suggests that maybe he could have a say in the outcome here.
Yeah, I guess he could if I think things would have to get pretty hot up front. I wasn't the biggest fan of his return race. Was won by a horse who's one of my favorites, Milton the Monster, but he's also a slop lover. It didn't come back very fast, so it seems like he'd have to take a pretty big step up. It is Todd Fletcher. He's been known to pop with some horses now and then at big prices that you don't expect, but for this one was hard to get to for me.
Yeah, and the other horse that I wanted to mention just briefly is the number 6, Plot the Dots. Of the two Lynn Cash horses in this race, I'd actually prefer him to Double Crown. I think the mile and an eighth distance works for Plot the Dots, and these Lynn Cash horses, they don't always do well first off the claim for him when he picks these horses up, but when they spend a little bit of time in the barn getting used to that routine, that aggressive routine, some of them really thrive on it. And I mean, he's run two of his best recent races in his last two starts, particularly two back when he won that allowance race at Laurel and beat a good horse in Zabra Kadabra, who came back to win with a comparable speed figure. And I didn't think he got the best trip last time when he was rated maybe a little bit too aggressively behind a slow pace that mostly held together. Didn't think his rider ever really gave him much of a chance that day. And he's one that I think is going to get dismissed at a decent price in here that could make some noise.
I could see him. I actually tried to make a case for him. The one negative I had about his last race, I saw the slow pace. When you go look, the winner was actually behind him early on in the race. Now, maybe he worked out a little better trip than Plot the Dots did, and I don't want to totally write him off because he didn't run terrible, and as you said, that race two back, it seems totally legit, that 116 speed figure, and that's as fast as Unbridled Bomber's been running in his wins. It just, he comes with a few more question marks.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking to that point, you're right. I kind of misspoke when I said the race was dominated by speed, but when you go and watch the last half of that race, there's a point on the backstretch where Plot the Dots is traveling really aggressively, and he's not allowed to move up at that point. He's kind of in behind horses, and he's kind of losing ground at the point in the race when the winner was making his move to get into contention, and they're rounding the far turn, and suddenly that horse, the winner, Nimitz Class, is 3 lengths ahead of Plot the Dots, and I think the rider just didn't basically execute the plan with the urgency needed given the pace situation. So spending some time talking about a horse that I think was just my third pick in this race, but I wanted to highlight him because I found this race to possibly be a little bit chalky. I think Unbridled Bomber and Law Professor were going to take most of the money, and Plot the Dots was kind of the one horse that I could make a case for at a bigger price. Let's move on to the final race in this Pick 5 sequence, Race 10. This is an open allowance race going 7 furlongs for fillies and mares. Yet another one that's drawn a pretty large field. There are 12 fillies and mares signed on for this race, and this is another one, Craig, where I had a tough time making the morning line. I'm not really sure where the public is going to go. I guess they have to respect the number one, Funny How, who has just been in great form for Ray Handel. She's reeled off 3 victories in a row, but nothing against the rider, Katie Davis, who I think has done a pretty good job in her limited opportunity since coming back from her own long layoff. But you do have to trust her to work out a trip from the rail in a large field with a horse that is not going to be in front. I mean, she's probably going to be somewhere in mid-pack. So, I mean, maybe that's a slight concern, but you have to respect the form this horse is in right now.
Yeah, and she takes the logical move into an open allowance, taking advantage of that condition where New York bred races don't count. So, maybe she has some class edge over some others in here, but the rail was a concern for me as well. Regardless of rider, but particularly for a rider that hasn't ridden very much lately and is probably going to be shuffled back a little bit, as you say. I didn't know which direction to go because I don't know the morning line. I'm not knocking you. That's a very tough one. I don't know where the money's going to go in this race either. The horse I think is clearly the best horse and the horse to beat is the 4-horse Yo Cuz, who was just an absolutely top form last year, winning 3 stakes races in a row very easily. Something seemed to have gone amiss in one of those New York Stallion stakes where she just didn't run at all at 1-5. Bill Mott gave her another chance about a month later, and she ran even worse, and she's been unsighted since. But she's also been working very well since that time. She's been working steady. She did have a brief gap, but she's come back with 2 very strong works since then. So she's one that I think is probably the horse to beat. I just don't know if she's going to be the favorite or not.
Yeah, she's a tough read for me, and I ultimately went against her in this race. She's a horse that generally does take a lot of money. Maybe that'll change here coming off the long layoff with those two poor performances showing recently, but she's just been a popular one with the bettors, and I'm always a little bit leery of horses like this, especially when they start to go the wrong way. I think one of the big problems in her last couple of starts earlier in 2021 was that she started having trouble getting out of the gate, and for a horse that wants to be on the lead, when you don't break well those first few strides from the starting gate, it really makes it tough to work out the right trip, and she just was not able to get in the right positions in her last two starts, and she just completely threw in the towel once she didn't make the lead. So I think that's a minor concern, though. What's a positive for her is that for a 12-horse field, Craig, there really isn't that much speed signed on here. So if she breaks well at all, she could find herself alone in the front end.
Yeah, and that's why I think I have to use her. I'm not making her my top pick. There's a couple others I'm going to talk about that I like a little more. But you bring up some good points about the gate, because it's not just those last few. She had some incidents in her debut. She had an incident, one of her easy wins, where she didn't get out of the gate very well. She was just so much better, it didn't seem to matter. But yeah, she's one that you have to be leery of that. But if she gets out, she's going to be dangerous. A couple that I wanted to mention are maybe coming from some lesser races, particularly the 9-horse Dame Cinco. I just really liked what I saw from her first off the claim for Rob Atras, a barn that's been really hot. I don't know what he did to get this horse going. She had been in pretty terrible form. He stepped her up in class. I guess it's up, maybe a similar in those starter allowances. It's always tough to get a read. TimeformUS class rating's actually a little bit lower, but generally I would think they're a little tougher races. And she just exploded back to her prior form that she had shown in a couple wins late summer, early fall, and ran a big speed figure for a 99. So I think that race was totally legit, and I think she's pretty dangerous in here. The other one I wanted to give a look to is for Linda Rice, who you mentioned has been red hot lately, and hot fudge in the 10-hole, coming off a very long layoff, over a year. But she's a horse who's shown some talent as well. She's been working steadily, has some fast works mixed in. She handled dirt. Kind of interesting to me that they bring her back at this point, because she ran so well in that turf stakes. You'd think maybe they'd want to wait for a little longer if they thought she was just a turf horse to Aqueduct maybe in April when they open the turf course again. But I think it's a really good sign they're bringing her back now.
Yeah, I think you brought up two of the more interesting horses in this race, and they're actually my top two picks in here. I did put Dame Cinco on top, that number 9 horse, and I mean, it just shows you the difference that a trainer can make. Barns that win a lot, when horses get claimed by them, their form can completely turn around. I mean, she was in the barn of a trainer that, just to be frank, doesn't do a whole lot of winning on this circuit. And moving into the Rob Atras stable, it was a completely different story last time. Put the blinkers back on. She had her speed back. That was going a mile, but I mean, she's handled shorter distances in the past, so I don't mind the turn back to 7 furlongs at all. And I agree with you. That was a powerful win visually. There were some decent runners in behind her, so I'm not sure how much of a step up in class this really is. And furthermore, I was looking up some stats for Rob Atras. It's not the biggest sample, but with horses that won last time, first off the claim for him, that are now coming back off that victory, second off the claim in dirt sprints, he's 7 for 17, a 41% win rate with a 259 ROI over the past 5 years. So these horses that he gets to win first off the claim, they usually hold their form for a little while. So I think Dame Cinco is very dangerous in here. And yeah, I'm also interested in Hot Fudge. Winning off long layoffs like this is not something that Linda Rice is necessarily known for, and I was a big fan of this horse back in 2021, and back then I did kind of have the impression that she was a little bit more of a turf horse. That dirt victory back in September, that was accomplished on a day when I thought the rail was really the place to be, and she rode the rail for almost her entire trip. So I thought that was somewhat of a bias-aided win, maybe dressed up her dirt performances a little bit, but she has talent. I mean, remember, those were 2-year-old races, so she's got a right to, just with natural natural progression be able to run a faster speed figure now. So I think she's a little bit interesting, and I'll be interested to see what kind of price she ends up going off at in this race, because it is pretty wide open, and I think it's definitely one you won't be able to see the board in a pick 5 sequence, but if you're just playing intra-race wagers, you want to let price be your guide, because there are some horses that might fall through the cracks in a race like this.
Yeah, those we pretty much covered the 4 that I was interested in. I'm not going to use the 1. I guess we've kind of talked about her. I just don't like the post. I think she might get shuffled back, especially in a race without a ton of speed. Tends to bottle things up. So of the 4 we mentioned, I was less interested in her. Any others in here that caught your eye?
I mean, I never want to overlook a horse like the number 3 Captain's Daughter, who just doesn't seem to attract a whole lot of respect from the bettors, but she usually shows up with good efforts. I mean, if you just isolate her dirt sprints recently, I mean, she generally puts forth a good performance. So, I mean, she's one that I think could be in the mix here. It's just, given the pace situation, her running style might not suit this race as well as it does some others. So that wraps up this late pick 5 sequence at Aqueduct on Saturday. As Craig and I probably were alluding to throughout, it's not the easiest sequence to get through. There are many horses to consider in a few of these races, especially outside of those 2 stakes events that might look a little bit logical. Those 3 other races in the sequence, I think there are multiple ways that you can go in all of them. And Craig, as we often do, let's just briefly recap how we might go about playing these races, kind of distilling our opinions down into a ticket structure. I'll let you go first.
Yeah, in the 6th race, that maiden race for 3-year-old fillies, I'm going to lean on the first-time starters. I would say Fabulous Funny and Senior Prank would be my A horses. I guess I would use Spelterini as a backup, and maybe the Tom Albatrani trained Machiavelli a little bit as like a C type. The others don't interest me in here. In the Claimer, this one is pretty wide open. I'm not going to use Musical Heart in here. I won't be able to see the board, so I'm just going to keep that negative opinion. I'm going to use the entry, particularly because of Perceived. If for some reason he was scratched, I wouldn't use the entry, but I'm definitely interested in him. I like some others in here. I think War Stopper is totally logical, so I would use him. And then I would use a couple of the closers we would talk about, Grump's Little Tots and Hammer and Aimer, the horse that you liked. In the Jerome, I think this one is a little more deeper than just going with the favorite Arctic Arrogance at 8-5. I'm with you on using the Chad Brown horse. I am definitely expecting some improvement from him. But you want to use a couple others as well, as Lugan Knight, the 4 horse in there, and also just a little bit of General Banker. He would be more like a C, Lugan Knight a B. The other 2 would be A types for me. In the Queens County, this one, even though it's a big field, I don't want to go too deep. I'm going to mostly stay with the 2 favorites in here, Unbridled Bomber and Law Professor. If I had to use somebody else, I mean, maybe I'd throw in Seafoam as a C-type, hoping he gets out of the gate and could steal the race, but most of my action's going to go through the other 2. And in the last race, I kind of settled on 3 horses. I'm going to use the 2 A's. It sounds like we're going to have the same 2, Dame Cinco and Hot Fudge. I just find both very interesting, and I'll still use Yo Cuz, because if she gets out of the gate, I think she could be gone.
Yeah, we agree in a few of these races. Pretty much similar opinions in that first leg. I think we're going to be on the same first-time starters, Fabulously Funny and Senior Prank. But yeah, generally wanted to be a little bit against Spelterini in that race. In the 7th, I think that the number 9, War Stopper, is way the horse to beat. He's an A on my tickets, but I would also want to use the number 10, Hammer and Armor, who is my price horse that I think is a little bit interesting in there. I would leave Musical Heart off my tickets. He's just not a horse that I'm particularly interested in any kind of short price, and generally we'll let these types beat me. They're just not trustworthy over time. In the 8th race, I like Neural Network. I think that he's going to take a step forward in this race. Totally respect Arctic Arrogance. I'm not against him. They'd be my main 2 uses in there, with maybe Lugan Knight as a slight backup, but I'd be somewhat surprised if anybody else wins that race. I totally get where Craig is coming from with General Banker. He's just, he wasn't quite for me, although I do see some positives with him. in the Queens County. Unbridled Bomber would be my top pick. Again, I respect the favorite, Law Professor, but Unbridled Bomber is going to be a slightly better price, and I think that he's got a little more upside than that other runner. And my long shot that I would include on some backup tickets is the number 6, Plot the Dots. And then closing things out in that 10th race, as Craig already said, we agree here. Dame Cinco, the number 9, would be my top pick. I respect Funny How. She's definitely on my tickets. And the number 10, Hot Fudge. Don't totally trust that this is the right spot for her off the layoff, but I do think there's some talent there and won't be surprised when she's effective in this race. So that's a look at a pretty complicated all-dirt pick 5 at Aqueduct on Saturday. And Craig, I'm looking forward to see how these races play out, especially one of these first few Derby preps for the 3-year-olds, or the newly turned 3-year-olds. I guess it finally is officially Kentucky Derby season with these points races being run for the 3-year-olds. So we've got a couple of them this week, the Jerome on Saturday, and then at Santa Anita, the Sham on Sunday. So I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss on the Pacecast next week.
Yeah, I'm really glad you picked the sequence. Some sequences are more fun than others in handicap, and I really enjoyed this one in all the races, not just the stakes races, even the claimer, which is something I'm usually not a big fan of.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in this week. Remember, you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch the TimeformUS Pacecast coming up next Tuesday.